So help me welcome Anya Parampil. Anya is a journalist with the GRAYZONE. She's previously hosted a daily progressive afternoon news program called In Question on RT America. She has produced and reported several documentaries, including on-the-ground reports from the Korean Peninsula and Palestine. So welcome, Anya.
Thank you so much for being here and making time out of your Tuesday to come listen to what I think is a very important issue and something that we can actually do something about as the US public. We need to have an awareness and resist not just the push for a military conflict with Venezuela, but also the economic war that is being waged on the country and has been for years now. Some of you might know I was recently inside of Venezuela's former embassy in Washington, D.C., as part of the embedded media covering the Embassy Protection Collective, which I'm sure many of you know was put together by a group of organizers, including Code Pink, the Answer Coalition, and Popular Resistance, to protect the grounds of Venezuela's diplomatic mission in Washington, D.C. from the illegal seizure and takeover carried out by the U.S. government and by extension Carlos Vecchio, Guaido's so-called ambassador to the United States. And what I learned being a part of that collective was a lot of what I already knew about how the U.S. government functions, but the Embassy Protection Collective, the embassy specifically, now it's the former embassy, we should be clear about that, it transformed Georgetown in Washington, D.C., one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the country, into a front line in the diplomatic war that is being waged against Venezuela. The way I see it, there are 4 wars being waged. There's the diplomatic war, on which Ambassador Moncada fights every day in the United Nations and other institutions that are, such as the Organization for the American States, where they are trying to give this coup attempt legitimacy. There's an economic war, which we're going to talk about tonight. There is a media war, propaganda war. That's why when I was in Venezuela with my team at the GRAYZONE and we were going to the stores and seeing that they were stocked, we were still seeing CNN reports claiming that you couldn't buy toothbrush and toothpaste in Venezuela, which was a lie. That's part of the media war. And then there's the constant threat of a hot military war and the involvement of the United States in funding paramilitary militias, right-wing groups in Colombia specifically, and making these threats constantly that an invasion or a war could take place. So those are the 4 fronts in the war. We're going to talk about the economic war. And at the Embassy Protection Collective, or during the Embassy Protection Collective, we experienced firsthand the tactics that the U.S. government uses on the Venezuelan people in order to crush the revolution and their spirit. The collective became kind of a microcosm because when they couldn't get us out by asking or threatening, there was constantly a talk that they could come in and arrest, but there was not until the end the specific threat. And when they couldn't do that, in order to force the activists out, the first thing they did was shut off our access from the rest of the world, from the rest of Washington, D.C., by sending groups of right-wing Venezuelans from, some of them came up from Miami, some of them are there working at think tanks and for the weapons industry in Washington, D.C. They surrounded the entire building in order to cut us off so we couldn't get food and we couldn't get water inside. I mean, it's exactly what they did to Venezuela. They try through sanctions to cut it off from the rest of the world. Then they had the right-wingers, the crazy right-wingers, acting extremely violent, people might not realize that even members of the collective from the outside, one of the allies that we had out there trying to deliver us food couldn't go to work for a month afterwards because he was injured so badly by these right-wingers, these absolute gangster thugs. They were absolutely disgusting. I mean, they assaulted me when I tried to ask Vecchio a question. They used the N-word to describe black people. They were extremely homophobic, would constantly hurl slurs at people who they decided looked different. And this is exactly what, again, Venezuelans experience in their country, and it's to a far more extreme level through these guarimbas and the violent opposition protests that have taken place. They transplanted some of that into Washington, D.C. But it didn't work. Even though they cut off the food, they cut off water, they were terrorizing us all night, banging pots and pans until 10 p.m. every night, blaring air horns first thing in the morning, shining lights directly into the top floors so that we couldn't sleep. When none of that worked, just like when sanctions didn't work in Venezuela in terms of convincing the Venezuelan people to support regime change, what did they do to the embassy? They cut off the electricity. The US government might want to deny that it had anything to do with the power outages which took place in Venezuela earlier this year, but it was a very telling tactic that was exactly the line they went for, the electricity and the water. And in the end, how did they win? Because federal US agents raided the embassy and arrested 4 remaining embassy protectors inside, Adrian Pine, David Paul, Kevin Zeese, and Margaret Flowers, extremely brave people who I was so inspired to work with. They were ready to go. They could have lasted another month or more inside of that embassy, and they were ready to do it. And what does that tell us again about the Venezuelan opposition? That they can't get the job done themselves. They need force, specifically force from the US government. It's the same thing that happened inside of that embassy. That is what the Venezuelan opposition wants to do in Venezuela, and that's the only way they'll win. Embassy grounds are supposed to be inviolable, according to the Vienna Diplomatic Convention. Carlos Vecchio, Guaido's ambassador, he actually signed a paper saying that if US agents damaged the property while they were inside, he wouldn't pursue any charges or punishment. That is exactly how they view their own country. They would say, open it up, we don't care who dies, we don't care how many people suffer, how many refugees are created, we just want to get in power again so that by extension, US capital and US industry can be in power again. When I got out of the embassy, I decided that I wanted to learn a little bit more about the characters that I had been encountering there, specifically Carlos Vecchio, because he was obviously driving the push in Washington, D.C., and he wasn't someone that we hear about typically as a popular face of the Venezuelan opposition. We hear about Leopoldo Lopez, we obviously hear about Guaidó, but as I looked into Vecchio, I started to realize that through learning his story and telling his story, you learn everything you need to know about the Venezuelan opposition, and also that he had an extremely influential role, an important role, a misunderstood and overlooked role in pushing for this coup. I wrote about Carlos Vecchio for the GRAYZONE in a piece that was released last week. It was quite extensive, but I'll just give you a summary. Carlos Vecchio tells people that he just entered politics when Chavez took over because he saw that his country was going to become a dictatorship. And that's a lie. The reality is Carlos Vecchio started out working pre-Chavez for PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company, which at that time had not been fully nationalized by Chavez. It was still open to private investment. And then he takes a job with Mobil before it merges with Exxon. So he's working for the oil industry up until '98 when Chavez takes power. Then he comes to the United States on a Fulbright scholarship, a State Department funded scholarship, studies at Georgetown, studies at the Harvard Kennedy School, which also happens to be where Leopoldo Lopez went. And then he returns to Venezuela and immediately starts working with US-funded NGOs, non-government organizations. It's a strange term if they're all funded by the US government, but that's what they are. And he immediately is involved with the NGO class. In fact, his roommate, one of his good friends, while he was in Washington, D.C., someone he knew even before his time in D.C., set up the State Department's Office for Transitional Initiatives in Caracas in 2002 after the coup. This is the office that pumps millions over the years, pumped millions of dollars into opposition groups, NGOs like the ones Carlos Vecchio was working with. And guess what he's also doing? He's leading Exxon's legal fight against the Chavez government for the restructuring of the oil industry that Chavez enacted. So Vecchio is an oil industry figure first and foremost, and he only quits politics in 2007 when Exxon is forced out of the country by Chavez. And he's eventually forced to leave Venezuela because he had a major hand in the 2014 La Salida exit campaign, where Leopoldo Lopez, who Vecchio founded Voluntad Popular with, this is the main US-backed party in Venezuela. Vecchio founded that party with Leopoldo Lopez. They try to say now Guaidó was involved in founding it, but he wasn't. He was a student that they picked up and brought into the party. It was Lopez and Vecchio, and these are the men who in 2014 he was on stage behind Lopez when Lopez made the call for protesters to go and march on the Attorney General's office in Caracas, and shortly after Lopez gave that order, activists, opposition rioters actually went and tried to burn the building down. So that's why he's forced to leave the country. Lopez is eventually under house arrest. When Vecchio gets to the United States, he immediately begins working with the US government to lay the groundwork for what would become the Trump administration coup. He writes about meeting with members of Congress, academics, people in the White House, and they, in March 2015, are successful in driving the Obama administration to classify Venezuela as a national security threat, signing that executive order in March 2015. And they make direct reference to the jailing of political prisoners, meaning Lopez, in that document. And that's what the Obama administration and subsequently the Trump administration uses to roll out and justify sanctions against Venezuela. And he also at that time runs a campaign at the OAS with Luis Almagro, the former Uruguayan foreign minister who's come into power, and they create a report based on Vecchio and his contacts, which Almagro delivers in May 2015, to invoke the Inter-American Democratic Charter at the Organization for the American States, which is a charter meant to handle states which, quote, seriously impair the democratic order. That is what prompts Venezuela to begin the process of exiting the Organization for the American States, because it became very obvious who controlled that organization at that point. It's no longer the OAS, it's the Organization of the United States. Just like many of these institutions, the United States wields disproportionate power. Over this time, the sanctions begin to have an impact, and we're told this lie that sanctions only target the government. That's what we started hearing the Obama administration say. But the reality is these sanctions made it impossible for Venezuela to pay its debt. And so immediately it begins defaulting on payments in the West, and then that gives Western credit institutions like S&P the pretext to downgrade Venezuela, make it seem as though Maduro is just so incompetent that he can't pay his bills, and as a result, create this scenario where Venezuela can't restructure its debt, can't pay its debt, can't do anything that other countries are simply just allowed to do. So the sanctions begin to have an impact. We begin to feel the development of an economic crisis in Venezuela, also, of course, impacted by the fall in oil prices in 2014. And eventually the Trump administration comes into power, and Trump appoints none other than Mr. John Bolton to be his national security advisor. Last fall, Bolton gave his Troika of Tyranny address when he named Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela as the Troika of Tyranny. And it's funny because actually when President Bush gave his State of the Union in 2002, the famous Axis of Evil speech, Bush initially named North Korea, Iraq, and Iran as the axis of evil. And then the next day at the State Department, there was another speech given expanding that list to include Libya, Syria, Cuba. Guess who gave that speech? John Bolton, when he was Under Secretary of State. So the Troika of Tyranny is an extension of the axis of evil. And why? It's a regime change list. They were openly naming the countries that they wanted to carry out regime change. And it's not a coincidence that Syria, Libya, Iraq, they all fell under this agenda. They also tell us that sanctions are supposed to encourage negotiation, right? That's what they say. They want to put pressure on the Maduro government so that they will come and have some sort of conversation. Well, then why then, earlier this year, did the U.S. Treasury Department sanction Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza of Venezuela, the top diplomat of the country? Does that sound like the kind of sanction that's going to encourage dialogue? Or if you're sanctioning your partner at the table, you're essentially telling them you're not interested in dialogue, you're only interested in regime change. The Trump administration escalated the sanctions this year when they specifically targeted Venezuela's oil industry and froze $7 billion worth of Venezuelan assets held in the United States. And the U.S. actually bragged about the impact these sanctions have had. On the State Department's website, they published a list about U.S. objectives and policy in Venezuela. And they deleted it within, a day? Because they knew it was stuff that they shouldn't be admitting to or portraying in a positive light. It included the fact that Venezuela couldn't sell oil or gold, and that 25 million barrels of Venezuela's crude is stranded off the coast with nowhere to go because of sanctions. They were bragging about crushing Venezuela's economy. And I should mention at the top of that list, U.S. policy accomplishments in Venezuela. What was number one? Juan Guaido declares himself interim president. What does that tell you about Juan Guaido? It's just an organic people's uprising, right? It doesn't really make sense then that is the outcome of U.S. policy. When this list, which I interviewed Ambassador Moncada at the time, and he described it as a confessions list, which is what it essentially was, I wrote an article about it at the GRAYZONE, and I interviewed Mark Weisbrot, because he had just released a report at the Center for Economic and Policy Research documenting 40,000 deaths, preventable deaths, which took place over the course of just 1 year in Venezuela because of these sanctions. And so what Mark told me is, he said, if I were the State Department, I wouldn't brag about causing a cut in oil production. This means even more premature deaths than the tens of thousands that resulted from sanctions last year. The U.S. is not ashamed to admit that its policy is resulting in the suffering of Venezuelans. But there's another aspect to the sanctions that I've only recently become more aware of through my work, and that is to provide cover for the literal theft of Venezuela's assets in the United States. And I can explain by returning to Carlos Vecchio, Mr. Exxon, because he, when he was asked earlier this year what he can do in the United States, considering he doesn't have a foreign ministry, and at the time didn't even have something he could call an embassy, and the answer he gave to PRI, Public Radio International, was bank accounts. We have bank accounts that belong to the Venezuelan government, and I represent the Venezuelan government, and I can, it is our job to protect those accounts and the Citgo accounts and the gold that's all here. Very strange answer for an ambassador to give. What are you going to do here? Oh, I'm going to meet with the president and advocate peace between my two nations is maybe an answer you would expect. But no, not Carlos Vecchio, especially because he sent his staff to a meeting in Washington, D.C. at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a oil, financial industry, and U.S. government-funded think tank. And the title of that event was Military Options, Assessing Military Options for Venezuela. Max Blumenthal, my colleague and friend at the GRAYZONE, reported on that story. That's not something an ambassador does, because apparently he's working with the bank accounts. So again, what does that tell me? It tells me the coup regime here has actually been given some of those accounts. And something else the Guaido administration moved to do very quickly was name a new board to PDVSA and Citgo, the two companies which oversee Venezuela's oil production. And even at the time, in January or February when this happened, Bloomberg magazine mocked this idea because they said, how can you just replace the board of a corporation? These people don't actually control anything on the ground in terms of oil production in Venezuela. So what is the purpose of assigning 10 random people sitting in the United States the title of board of Citgo and PDVSA? It was to transfer the accounts to them. What else? And the woman that they appointed to lead Citgo, Luisa Palacios, she, before she was doing this, was working for a premier consulting firm for top hedge funds and investment banks all over the world. She was specifically charged with analyzing Latin America energy policy. Now she's in charge of a Latin American-based energy company. That to me sounds very corrupt. She also was a World Bank advisor and investment bank advisor, so that's who they put in charge. Who else do they put in charge? They put in this man, Andres Eloy Padilla. He's a financial analyst who was appointed by his brother, who is in the Energy Committee in the legally defunct opposition-controlled Venezuelan parliament. Two other board members, Luis Urdaneta and Angel Omeda, they were former PDVSA and Citgo employees, top-level executives, vice president, chief operating officer of PDVSA. They left the company in '98 when Chavez took over. So these are the people who they've put in charge of Citgo. They just transferred the wealth that Venezuela had here back into the hands of the people who had it before the revolution and have been dying to get their hands on it ever since. So that's why I say these sanctions have provided cover for a theft, a massive transfer of wealth. And I would like to know, just to wrap, the questions that I'm going to be focusing on going forward. I want to know who is paying Vecchio, who is paying Carlos Vecchio, and he has a staff of dozens of men in Washington, D.C., who I've encountered at the embassy and at the Organization for American States. They have a shadow government here. They don't have one in Venezuela because they can't get power there, but they have a shadow government here. And they're living in Washington, D.C., some of them. I think Vecchio's still living in Miami. But how are they paying for their apartments? How are they living their lives? They're not working at those cushy think tank jobs anymore. I would like to know if they're not using that stolen money. It seems like a very simple question because they say, Vecchio's words were, it's the Venezuelan government's money, I represent that. So they seem to be justifying this. And I'll just close by saying, as we should go forward asking those questions and be aware of this theft, because it should be a huge scandal. I would think even some mainstream reporters, and you might be surprised to hear me say this, but I think even some mainstream reporters would want to crack that case. Where did this money go? And are these people living off stolen wealth? The last thing I learned in the embassy was that not only is this how my government functions through bullying, thuggery, and violence, but also the minute any one of us as US citizens stands up to resist it, they will just as quickly use the tactics they employed to pillage and destroy countries abroad on you and us and the people here. We're the same in their eyes, and that's why I always say, you, me, the people in this room, we have more in common with the people of Venezuela than we do with the government that represents us, claims to represent us, which is funded by the same corporations which want to get their hands in Venezuela once again, and the same corporations which fund the Venezuelan opposition. So we have to be very aware of that and continue. I mean, the work of Code Pink and Answer, I am just so happy and grateful for, because the marches that we've been having in Washington, D.C., the Embassy Protection Collective, these kinds of things are those are the ways that we can change power. I know that through the Embassy Protection Collective, we were making Elliot Abrams personally upset, and that felt pretty good. But we have to be creative and think of other ways that we can directly hit the empire and continue to resist it. Thank you. Oh, you have one. Addressing the question as to things were so bad before sanctions, therefore they can't be blamed for the current crisis. While we can point to sanctions starting and intensifying in 2015, we should keep in mind that the economic war against Venezuela has been constant since Chavez won democratic elections in '98, particularly in terms of the domestic oligarchy's war on the state. So when you talk about things like a queue, we have to remember what Terry already pointed out, that between 60 to 80, what was the number you gave? 80% of the economy is private. So Maduro and Chavez aren't deciding whether or not to stock the shelves with toilet paper. It's some oligarch who controls that supply. That's why the government has uncovered warehouses of medicine and warehouses of basic goods that these people are hoarding deliberately from their own countrymen because they would rather control the country on behalf of the United States. So that has been going on since before sanctions. These people have been causing shortages, waging war, but the reality is people can have personal anecdotes that make it hard for us to confront this narrative that people are suffering. It's devastating to hear that you lost a family member because of an inability to access drugs. But bridging Terry's final point, all you have to do is look at the data, look at numbers, look at charts of any social measure from the 90s until now. Infant mortality, any other social measure, access to education, for things to be very bad, I think that's an unfair characterization. They were way worse in the 90s and experienced relative growth. And to me, I guess the way that I always view it is, years ago I watched the documentary The War on Democracy by John Pilger. I'm sure plenty of you have seen that. And it always stuck out to me, a conversation he was having with one of the women he interviews in the documentary, speaking about the revolution. And she says, before the revolution in Venezuela, the maps of Caracas and the country, but specifically Caracas, all the barrios and the poor neighborhoods would appear green. Afterwards, we realized those maps actually should include people. And so, to me, the question and the tension in Venezuela isn't only about whether or not the United States can control the resources and dictate policy in the country, but it's a question of who is actually included in society. Some people may have been able to receive medical attention and education just fine in the 90s, but for the vast majority of people, that wasn't the case. They were suffering, and there's no way anybody could convince me. I mean, maybe produce some sort of data, show it to me, but I've looked at the charts. It all goes up after the revolution, and there's really no way you can dispute that. Well said, both of you. It's funny you brought up the case of Henri Falcone in relation to the question of sanctions because, yes, he was the one opposition candidate who broke the boycott the opposition observed last year when Maduro was reelected. And what did the U.S. do? They threatened to sanction him personally for participating in the elections because they want so desperately to delegitimize Venezuela's democratic process in order to make the case as a dictatorship. I just always like to point out that fact because I think it says a lot about the narrative that Venezuela is a dictatorship in the eyes of the U.S. government. On the question of sanctions and what can be done here, what Ben and Terry have said about the need to organize an anti-war movement totally fits with my feelings as well. But I think there's another level of the solution that's going to come from outside of the United States, connected to what Ben talked about during the last round of questions, which was he very well, in very simple language, explained how we here in the United States, because we're at the center of the empire, just take for granted the fact that the dollar is the world's reserve currency and that every country in the world needs to have a reserve of our currency. And that is part of the evolution of the international economy under the U.S. empire. But we've reached a point now where the U.S. can only sustain itself by waging war, through waging war to maintain control over resources and keep the empire going, but also just keep the economy going and produce weapons, because it's one of the few things we really export and produce at massive levels in this country, or not one of the few things, but everybody knows how much weapon sales play into the U.S. government. And it's only able to maintain its control of the financial system through its ability to enforce it with the military. But we've reached a point now with the sanctions on Venezuela and the sanctions particularly on Iran and Russia and China, the trade war as well, where even capitalist allies of the United States and Europe are upset. They want to do business with Russia. They want to do business with Iran. And it's created a situation that's alienating even our closest allies. And just last week or 2 weeks ago, I read in Foreign Policy magazine, the headline was, "For Europe, ditching the dollar dictatorship is a dream." And that used to be the kind of terminology we would only hear someone like President Putin in Russia or President Ahmadinejad in Iran saying the dollar dictatorship. But now this is in a U.S. paper, and they actually quoted the former head of the U.S. Sanctions Office, the Office for Foreign Asset Control, who quit last year. He resigned because he felt the Trump administration was getting too intense in these sanctions, and he specifically said the fear is that we're creating a scenario for even our allies that they want to find an alternative to the U.S. dominated financial system. That's what's happening. The German foreign minister was recently in Iran talking about the need to move away from trade solely based on the dollar. Venezuela's national industry minister, Tarek al-Assami, was recently in St. Petersburg for the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. They signed agreements to do trade with Russia in rubles, and for Russia to set up pharmaceutical companies in Venezuela to start producing these medicines that they need in Venezuela. So the solutions are not just here. The rest of the world is figuring out how to move on from us because we have done nothing but terrorize them. And especially over recent years, it's gotten to the point that, yeah, even Europe doesn't want to acknowledge these sanctions anymore. And I'll just say finally that I agree that it sometimes feels like an uphill battle just because of if I'm only focused on the media and my role and how I'm being judged by fellow journalists in the corporate media, then it feels like an uphill battle. But when I talk to people all around the country, just like you said, Ben, that Gloria did recently, I find that everywhere there's a group of people like you who want to come and have these conversations. When I went on Fox News on the day of the coup and criticized Trump policy and the coup's failure on the most watched show in prime time in the United States, all I got was positive feedback. I got so many messages from people all around the country of different political affiliations. And so did the host. The segment went viral. Why? Because we actually are the majority. So we shouldn't let them convince us for 1 second that we, the people in this room, don't represent the 99% of people who live in this country. They don't, I mean, you could even tell, you don't have to convince them that Maduro's not a dictatorship. They just don't want to go to war. So we can win. And I think having conversations like this and asking these questions is how we're going to do it. So thanks.
We have Ben Becker, who is an anti-war organizing with the Answer Coalition, an editor of Liberation News, a monthly socialist newspaper. He has written extensively on Latin America and was a lead organizer for the March 16th Hands on Venezuela National March in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Ben.
In 1915, there was a revolt in Haiti in which the U.S.-backed dictator was targeted by an uprising. And at that time, the U.S. government, led by the Klansman Woodrow Wilson, immediately intervened. And they sent Marines into Haiti without really hardly any pause, as they did many times throughout Latin America. And they went, they said, to reestablish peace and order. But of course, what all of the historical record has shown is that it was transparently actually to preserve U.S. financial and economic interests. And in Port-au-Prince, they seized the entire gold reserves of the people of Haiti and took it back to Washington with them. The entire gold, they just emptied it out the vaults and left. Complete international piracy. If that were to happen in 2019, that would be a big scandal, because you're not supposed to go into countries, banks, and steal all of their national wealth, which was accumulated from the labor and the toil of generations of workers. But that is what's happened with Venezuela. And of course, they didn't send the Marines in to do it. They just did it they did it digitally. They froze the accounts of the gold reserves that are being held in Europe, and I believe here some in the United States, but I think fundamentally in Europe. And they just said, this gold no longer is under your authority, under your discretion, and we're instead going to give it to folks like Carlos Vecchio. So we should respond with the same level of outrage as we would if 104 years ago the U.S. Marines went and seized the national wealth of a sovereign country. We should react that way today. But it is a buried story. It's not even on the headlines of most national newspapers. And people also, when they hear about a frozen bank account, that doesn't exactly sound like an international war crime. It doesn't sound like warfare at all, but it is warfare. And it's important also because when we throw out these big numbers, $9 billion in gold reserves, $5 billion net worth of Citgo. I mean, I don't think we have any billionaires in the room, so we hear about billions and we think, oh, billions, it's like that. Those numbers are so large that they don't really, they're hard to grasp, right? None of us are budgeting numbers like that. But the government of Venezuela is budgeting numbers like that. And those numbers are the exact numbers they need to import the necessary food and medicine to sustain the population. And that doesn't just derive from the Bolivarian Revolution, but the long history of Venezuela has an economy that was structured around oil sales and using the revenue from oil sales to purchase the things that were necessary to live: food, medicine, technology, other basic supplies. Those were not, there wasn't a local manufacturing or agricultural sector sufficient to sustain the entire population. So when you start seizing billions of dollars, that means you're directly saying Venezuela cannot provide for its people and those people will suffer. But that report says there's 40,000 deaths that have happened on account of sanctions since 2017. The August 2017 sanction, as Anya said, made it impossible for Venezuela to access U.S. financial markets. And U.S. financial markets are the heart of the global financial system. And then the January 2019 sanctions cut off all U.S. Oil purchases from Venezuela. And even despite all the political and ideological conflict between the U.S. and Venezuela, the U.S. represented over a third of Venezuelan oil sales. So you're talking about the #1 source of revenue for a government and sinking it almost to zero or as much as possible. It's very similar to the type of strangulation that the U.S. has attempted against the revolutionary government of Cuba for the last 6 decades. I think many activists here are familiar with the techniques and the methods of the U.S. blockade of Cuba. The Helms-Burton Law, many other types of sanctions that have been used. For instance, if you're a company that does business in Cuba that's taking place on land or property that was taken from the Cuban government in 1959, then your company can be sued by the descendants of the Cuban owner from the 1950s in U.S. courts. And of course, they'll get summary judgments from any U.S. judge saying so that makes it very hard for any businesses to open up in Cuba. We need to familiarize ourselves with the new methods of how they're waging war against Venezuela, because they're not identical methods, but the objective is just as crippling. And for the 40,000 who have died, of course, there's probably 10 or 100 times as many people whose lives have been directly affected, many, many times more. People who can't now access insulin, people with hypertension who can't access insulin, people with HIV who can't receive medicine for that. The caloric intake of the Venezuelan people has been reduced. The amount of food that can get into the bellies of children has been impacted by these sanctions. That's how we have to describe these sanctions, not as technological, sort of technocratic ways of avoiding warfare. This is violent warfare, and it's in the sense that it's having a physical impact on an entire population. I want to just, I think, lay out a little bit of the sort of strategic context in which all this is happening, because I think for an anti-war movement to emerge again as a powerful force in the United States, that's necessary. We have to sort of situate ourselves and understand what's sort of behind the headlines. We can't underestimate the importance of the Bolivarian Revolution, which really radicalized after 2002 when the people overthrew the US-backed coup. The Bolivarian Revolution for this whole last period of global history has been like a beacon of light in which counter-revolution was the norm. And you could take that back to the 1970s and 1980s, the Reagan years. Of course, there was resistance and revolutionary upsurges in places like Central America, but the general norm of the last 35, 40 years has been counter-revolution. The period from World War II to the late 1970s, it was revolution, anti-colonial revolution, socialist revolution, national liberation struggles. But in this whole neoliberal era since really the opening of China to the present, it's been very hard for working class people, oppressed people to secure victories and make revolutionary triumphs. Venezuela really stood out as something different that was happening. And it started in a kind of unlikely place, and maybe for an unlikely person. People in the left didn't even know about Hugo Chavez that much. But once he was in there, he made a huge difference in mobilizing the people and raising a socialist horizon for the Bolivarian Revolution. It started as really an anti-imperialist, anti-neoliberal revolution, and it grew into a socialist revolution, a socialist horizon. And from Venezuela, that began to impact all of Latin America, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina. Not every country had the same horizon. There's an activist in Argentina who I had the pleasure of meeting here, Manuel Bertoldi, is that right? That's his name, from Patria Grande, a very important organization in Argentina. And he described that in the previous historical period, there have been 3 different projects in Latin America, what he called the neoliberal project. I think we're all familiar with that. That's austerity, cutbacks, increasing the rate of exploitation, the theft of natural resources, the right-wing governments. That's one project, the neoliberal project. Second, there was what he called the neo-developmental project, which was not as radical as, for instance, Venezuela, Cuba, did not have a socialist horizon. The neo-developmental project, as exemplified maybe in Brazil, Argentina, to some extent Ecuador, they were trying to work with the US-led economic system, trying to build a cross-class alliance, but also to share more of the income and the economic growth with the poor. And then third, the third project was ALBA, the Bolivarian alternative for the people of Latin America. And ALBA really did have a socialist horizon, with Cuba and Venezuela as the anchors. And if you look at the last 10 years, starting under the Obama administration, not the Trump administration, they've been turning back to Latin America, what they call their backyard, the historic backyard. That's why Woodrow Wilson was able to go in 1915, because he saw Latin America as the extended territory of the United States. This was the Monroe Doctrine. And starting in 2009, they overthrow Manuel Zelaya in Honduras. In 2012, there's a form of a coup against the Paraguayan president. There's a judicial coup against Dilma, and now to prevent Lula from running. They've been tightening the screws on all of Latin America, something they couldn't do when they were bogged down in the Middle East. But now that they've been able to pull their forces out of the Middle East somewhat, they're again turning back to Latin America. So that's the crown jewel, the holy grail for them is, can they overturn the Venezuelan revolution? And for them, going after Venezuela is a part of a larger strategy to recapture all of Latin America, to go after Cuba, to go after Nicaragua. And we should understand all of these processes as fundamentally interlinked. I want to close by speaking about this notion of the new forms of warfare, because the US empire has a fundamental contradiction, and that is that they operate on the basis of pure power, military might. They like to claim that the US leadership in the world is based on values, but of course people of the world fundamentally reject the values of the United States and generally hate its government, not its people, but generally hate its government. The US empire is backed up on pure force, 800 bases, the projection of power across all of the lands and seas of the world. And yet at the same time, every time they directly intervene with those military forces, they face an increasing anti-war sentiment in the United States, which is a political factor in their equation, in their thinking, in their calculations. And they face even wider rejection from the peoples of the world. So how do you preserve an empire which is based on military power, and that military power protecting all these complex financial institutions? How do you do that if you can't so clearly intervene as you used to be able to? The US military has this sort of concept of the demonstration effect. Why did they really attack Afghanistan? Was Afghanistan a threat to the United States? No. Why did they really attack Iraq? It's true they have resources that are important, but it's also important that they have to be continuously showing to potential rivals, other imperialist countries like in Western Europe, and also other independent countries, that we are not afraid to use our military power. But now they've reached the new stage where they're pulling back from that type of military intervention, or at least they're showing a lot of hesitation. So they've developed much more sophisticated forms of hybrid war, dirty wars, sanctions, dark ops, cyber war. We have to really study this, because this is the essence of modern warfare. The question of war and peace which I think all of us can say, well, we're for peace, not for war. That has been fundamentally shifted in this current stage of imperialism. Economic sanctions is the new tactic of choice for the US ruling class. And for an anti-war movement to emerge, we can't just be thinking in that same way about we're against bombers and we're against troops. We have to make sanctions the heart of what we're agitating around. And no politician who says they're for sanctions, not war, is a friend of the anti-war movement. That is a pro-war politician. They shouldn't be given a pass. If they say we're for these forms of strangling independent people, but not these more overt forms which would land photos on the cover of the newspaper, that is not a friend. That is a deceiver who's come to actually pull the wool over your eyes. So the anti-war movement has to get very principled, get very smart, and we have to really ask these politicians, if you're anti-war, what's your position on sanctions? Thank you. I just wanted to add the question of the economic problems of Venezuela, I think, are also shrouded in a lot of mystification, that it's sort of, if you change the president, the rate of inflation will come down. And other inflation is really the problem, as the ambassador was describing here, the hyperinflation. And it was high inflation before, 2013, 14, 15, with as he was describing, with the decline in oil revenue, and which was worldwide, all the oil producing states. What was different about Venezuela, of course, is that it had commitments to the people compared to the other oil producing states, which allow people to starve to death in the name of financial stability, in the name of financial sort of austerity. So it decided not to choose the route of austerity. And instead of being blamed for that, they should be complimented, I believe. But Venezuela is still within a world financial system where they do not hold all the cards. And I think that has to really be wrestled with. In the years after the economic depression/recession in the United States, the US issued trillions of dollars. They just printed it and gave it out to the banks. Now, if another country does that, they're considered a financial basket case. They're not following the rules of finance. But when the US does it, it actually had a huge impact in restoring financial stability. Why? Because something is so special about the US? Well, what's so special is that we are living in a global financial system where everyone is invested in confidence in the US dollar. So nobody wants to say we no longer have confidence in the US dollar. So the US government has these range of tools that they can use to artificially prop up their economy when it deals with boom and bust. And yet Venezuela can't access the same tools. It can't access the same tools because it can't restructure its debt, because it's described by private entities to be a low confidence borrower. The insurance companies downgrade it, so then nobody wants to invest. I mean, have we ever sat back and thought about foreign currency exchanges and rates? In the US, you don't have to think about that because we're paying in a dollar, which is essentially stable, because we're in the center of the empire. But if you're in another country, you have to always be thinking about these currency rates. How are they determined? Are they determined by some scientific measure? Not at all. In fact, it's a politicized agency, the Federal Reserve, and their operatives, which control some of that. And then you have completely shadowy organizations. There's a website called Dollar Today, which sets its own currency rate exchange with the Bolivar in Venezuela. And that has the impact of leading to just wild speculation and confusion about what the actual ratio is. So even if you use all these tools to try to stabilize prices, there's all these forces working against you. The Venezuelan government can send in a soldier and say, we're going to lower the prices in this market. But what are they going to do? As soon as the soldier walks out, they can put the old price back up, unless you want to have a Venezuelan soldier in every market, right? But that would be considered dictatorship. Or I mean, or are they supposed to nationalize everything? That's what some on the left say. Nationalize everything. I think that this is also highly simplistic. Nationalize food distribution, but you still have to import the food. You can nationalize the warehouses that exist, but then who's going to send more food to come? You know, there's a lot of problems. They nationalized oil. That was a good thing. But if you can't access parts, if you can't access credit, you know, all these problems that Venezuela faces only because it chose to be independent. Only just because it chose to be independent. That we in the United States don't have to deal with because we're living in a country that's on the other side of that equation. So we have to be very humble in, I think, trying to understand the complexity of the problems. Those are problems which none of us have had to resolve.
Buenas noches. Good evening. Welcome to the People's Forum. My name is Renata Pumarol. I'm going to be speaking a little slow for the translation. My name is Renata Pumarol. I'm the coordinator of international projects here at the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a movement incubator for working class communities and marginalized communities here in the States. For those of you who have been here before, for those of you who have just walked into our space, you know right away that we are an internationalist space. And that's why we are here at this event today. We stand in solidarity with working class people from all over the world. And today we stand in solidarity with working class people of Venezuela. It's been an honor to put together this event. We are not only putting together this event so that you learn about sanctions, so that you learn the history. We want you to learn the history. But we also want you to walk out of here and take action against sanctions in Venezuela and beyond. I will kick it off to Claudia to introduce them, and thank you so much for being here.
¿Cómo estamos? ¿Se ven bien? So my name is Claudia de la Cruz, and I'm one of the directors and part of the collective that put together the People's Forum, and it's a huge honor for me to be able to be in conversation and facilitate the conversation around sanctions, which so often get brushed off. You know, we hear the word and we usually don't understand the impact of sanctions on people's lives. We connect it to punishment, and we don't know who is being punished and why. And I think, you know, this conversation is primarily very much important because there's all sorts of attacks that have been waged against the people of Venezuela, the people that have stood with dignity to defend the revolutionary process that is theirs. It's the people's process. And so we are very glad to be able to host this conversation in the context of US governments waging war against the world. There are currently formally, and I'll say this, formally 13 countries that are under sanction by the United States of America. 13, formally, because there's all the ways that informally the United States have found to attack governments and nations and people that are not aligning with them politically and economically. And so, again, we're honored to be able to have folks that could share their experience and also share the knowledge of the impact on sanctions, particularly on the Bolivarian revolution, which is a people's revolution.